You'll remember, friends, that when I first came to you to let you in on God's masterstroke, I didn't try to impress you with polished speeches and the latest philosophy. I deliberately kept it plain and simple. First, Jesus and who he is, then Jesus and what he did, Jesus crucified. I was unsure how to go about this and felt totally inadequate. Paul may be stretching a point here. Self-confidence was never really Paul's problem. I was scared to death, if you want the truth of it. Okay, a little poetic license maybe. And so nothing I said could have impressed you or anyone else. But the message came through anyway. God's Spirit and God's power did it, which made it clear that your life of faith is a response to God's power, not to some fancy mental or emotional footwork by me or anyone else. We, of course, have plenty of wisdom to pass on to you once you get your feet on firm ground, but it's not popular wisdom, the fashionable wisdom of the high-priced experts that will be on Oprah next week. Oh, that's not what it says. That will be out of date in a year or so. God's wisdom is something mysterious that goes deep into the interior of God's purposes. You don't find it laying around on the surface. It's not on the bestseller list. It's not the latest message. It's more like the oldest. What God determined as the way to bring out his best in us long before we ever arrived on the scene. The experts of our day haven't a clue about what this eternal plan is. If they had, they wouldn't have killed the master of the God-designed life on a cross. That's why we have this scripture text. No one's ever seen or heard anything like it. Never so much as imagined anything quite like it, what God has arranged for those who love him. But you've seen and heard it because God, by his Spirit, has brought it all out into the open before you. Paul always seems to be in an argument with someone. Paul's fascinating. Everybody loves Paul. Paul really did a lot to shape Christianity, but Paul is quarrelsome. But often he has a good reason. He's trying to be helpful. He's trying to guide people in the way of Jesus when their gut instincts or their cultural pressures drive them to walk in what Paul and Jesus call the way of the world. In this reading today from our family storybook, Paul begins by reminding his hearers that something significant really did happen in Corinth. And it wasn't because of a frothy emotional appeal on the part of Paul. Somehow, in spite of Paul, he seems to suggest, God connected with these people, and these people connected with God in an amazing and authentic way. Somehow, an implausible and off-putting message was delivered to the Corinthians by an unimpressive speaker. And it is an implausible and off-putting message. If you're not annoyed by the gospel, at least some of the time, you might be missing the point. But ultimately, it changed who they were, and it changed how they lived in the world, and it changed their world. As we observed in our before Christmas worship focus, what Paul does here is he cooperates with God. He starts then together, he and God and the Corinthian church, and then they carry it forward. How do we start on our path to risk something big for something good? Well, we first talked about realizing what our gifts were and where they might be used. We immersed ourselves in the idea that curiosity is a more helpful stance in the world. And today, we're going to talk about S for start. S for start. This is where we stop thinking and pondering and praying and learning, and we take a step. And we start by paying attention to spirit, to promptings, to nudgings, to discomfort, to where the energy seems to be. And it is uncomfortable to get prompted and nudged and urged. And it is uncomfortable to try and discern where that's coming from. That's why we need places and people who can help us with the discernment process, where we can sort out what really is the Spirit of God calling us and what is not. I believe that's why we have a church, so we can help one another with clarity, so we can help one another with discernment, so we can encourage one another when we feel hesitant, and when we can put the brakes on one another when we're being impulsive. That's what the church is here for, as we work together to light up the world, to become compassionate change makers in the way of Jesus. So let's just acknowledge that starting isn't easy or simple at all. And we need spiritual companions for that. We talked a little more about relationships just last week, and if you want to see those sermons, if you're online or you're here and you missed those sermons, then you can go on our YouTube channel, you can go on our website, ffumc.net, or you can get on Facebook and scroll back through till you get last week's worship service. Our spiritual starting place is a kind of stepping out and letting go at the same time. The heart of Christianity is the self-emptying. Don't pay attention to that fancy word kenotic. That just means self-emptying. Self-emptying humility of God expressed in Jesus Christ. We start by practicing being more open to the Spirit than we have been. We set aside our tendency to say, I know that. Anybody have a toddler in their life? A talking toddler, okay? I'll tell you something about toddlers. Starting about age 3, and then theoretically they stop saying this eventually, but I'm not sure. If you tell your toddler, that's dangerous, don't do this, I know that. You put your shoes on the wrong feet, I know that. I know that as the answer to everything is great for a 3-year-old. Maybe not so much for grown-ups. The argument Paul is having with this church in Corinth is because they know that. They already know that, and they know that, and they know that, and they know that. They are actually a pretty urbane and sophisticated group of folks. Corinth is actually at the crossroads of east-west trade and north-south trade. So it's a port city. There's a tremendous variety in who's there. It's pretty seedy, and but these are people who are like, we're from New York City. We're from New York City. We are sophisticated and urbane, and our knowledge and our hipness and our coolness and the fact that we already know whatever it is you think you're going to tell us, that's where we get our wisdom from. It's a wisdom they can control and manage, and that's what's happened in Corinth. For Paul, though, he sees that as a big red flag. Because when people say, I know that, and they're not ready to get a new story, it's usually because they're afraid. It's because they're afraid. Fear. I'm going to tell you an experience that happened to me. I'm not very happy about it. I'm still kind of embarrassed about it, and it was even worse this morning because of some stuff that happened out front. But about a dozen years or so ago, I found myself getting a new story when I heard someone talk about homelessness and permanent supportive housing. It was someone who had been homeless themselves. They had fled an abusive situation with a station wagon full of kids, and they were homeless for 3 years while they put their life back together. First, this speaker said, let's just put it in the plainest possible terms. The answer to unhoused people is to house them. The answer to unhoused people is to house them. How exactly we're going to do that is a lot more difficult and complicated, and we don't all agree on that. Next, the speaker pointed out what the obstacles are, and it's complicated, it takes money, people resist help, all of that. And then the speaker talked about the obstacle of a particular slice of the population. Part of the reason things don't get solved is there's no will to solve them, because there is a slice of the population who have a huge resentment that someone who was undeserving might get something they don't deserve, that bad, lazy people would take unfair advantage of. Their core belief, in that place down deep where we don't even know we believe it, was that people get what they deserve, or at least they should. And they for sure shouldn't get what they don't deserve. And I am ashamed now to tell you that struck me to the heart. I don't know if it's the household I grew up in, or my white middle-class American culture, or just the way my brain and emotions work, but I believed that. I believed it deep down where I didn't even know how profoundly I believed it, and I didn't even know why I believed it. The speaker then shared a rational, logical observation I had never considered. Here's the proposition. If we give everyone who needs it a place to live, furthermore, if those places are supportive, in other words, they have staff to help people who don't know how to manage their lives, because that's how you get homeless often, is you know how to manage your life, and then people will help. It works for everybody. It works for nearly everybody. And here was the logic. It's way, way cheaper. It's vastly cheaper. It's like 10% of what it costs to have police forces and fire folks, and the money we spend on trying to solve the homeless problem. And there was just a whole bunch of things going on in my head that was basically, yeah, but what about? Yeah, but what about? Yeah, but what about? And I don't think I was wrong. Gets people, but they went on. They said, look, how much would you pay to get people off the streets, to get people to not be rummaging through your trash bin and leaving a pile of trash in your parking lot? How much would you pay if you could sit down at a sidewalk cafe and no one would scuffle up to you? And how much would you pay not to have to pick up after someone who decided to defecate in your bushes? All of what makes us feel resentful, and as heartless as it may sound, I resented. I did then, I do now, would be gone. It would be gone. Furthermore, the idea that such an arrangement would encourage people to become homeless or stay homeless is proven not to be the case. Helping people tends to help them help themselves. People mostly don't take unfair advantage of a situation like that. But our sense, my sense, our sense, some of us, that it's not fair and people should experience the consequences of their actions is really strong in us. And it was in me. And I still believe that. I believe that we experience the consequences of our actions. But none of that helps solve the problem of homelessness. So eventually I was persuaded by the logic to get a new story. But softening my heart took a lot longer. I had to get a very new story. I had to begin to consider things from a very different perspective before my heart could be softened even just a little. No 13-year-old ever wrote in their diary, gee, I hope to be so rebellious that I become a meth addict and homeless. Deserving and undeserving are not helpful categories for solving this problem. Deserving versus not deserving are not helpful categories for solving this problem. They're reflections of emotional reactions, not thoughtful problem solving. And then I had to learn this. I'm okay. I don't have to be afraid. And that's when I discovered deep down in me, one of the reasons I was so frustrated and angry and hard-hearted was because I wanted to believe deep down inside of me that that could never happen to me. Because my greatest fear is that someday I'll be homeless and I'll die. I see a couple of you nodding. And here's how it goes. Something happens. Someone says something unkind to me. And I think, oh, nobody likes me. I'm going to lose my job. And then I won't get enough of my retirement because it's too soon to retire. And then I'll be homeless and I'll die. 4 steps. That's all it takes. And you can't even count how short the time is for that to happen. Yeah, but that was the one that got me. You're okay. You don't have to be afraid. I remember when I got that, it struck me so forcefully, it hit my chest and I couldn't breathe for a minute because I realized that I was so deeply afraid of that I wasn't even ready to acknowledge it, and it colored my view of the world, and it prevented me from seeing what the answer might be. So what was my answer in the meantime? Well, I would work hard on my mental health, my relationships, my financial stability. And this actually, it turns out, deepened my anger and resentment and even made my belief stronger that people who were worse off than me were so because they didn't work hard enough. This protected me from my fear. This belief that undeserving people shouldn't get stuff, and that only deserving people should get stuff, and that people would take unfair advantage, and that's why we shouldn't just like stick people in housing and help them. That belief protected me from my fear. And I needed to get a new story for that. This is not actually a sermon about solving homelessness, because frankly, if it was easy enough to solve homelessness that I could figure it out, there would be no homeless people. So don't come to me after the sermon and explain to me how I'm wrong about the homelessness thing. I probably am. It's not the point. The point is, it takes a lot to get a really new story. For me, this was one of the things that was really hard to get a new story about. And I am sufficiently embarrassed about it that I thought it might help you too. And frankly, my heart isn't soft as it should be. I've made progress to being more compassionate, like Jesus wants me to be, but not enough. It's just the story of how one person got a new story about something so deep and so big that I didn't even know I was clinging to it out of fear, not a rational thought. So, to sum up, when we start, R-I-S-K, when we start, we look at the stories we currently hold, and we ask, how are they comforting me but blocking God from getting to me? What stories do I hold on to that make me feel good, but may be blocking me from hearing God's promptings? And then we choose to reshape the way we think by noticing where we are uncomfortable. When you begin to notice where you're uncomfortable and you are curious, a new story will begin to emerge. There's a very old folk tale. I'm sure you've heard it, but it's just so apropos for today. An elder Cherokee Indian was teaching life's truths and principles to his grandchildren. And he said, you know, deep inside me there is a battle going on between two wolves. There is one wolf that is fear and anger and anxiety and regret and sorrow and arrogance and hatred and resentment and lies and pride. But also in there, fighting with that wolf, is a different wolf who stands for peace and joy and love and hope and sharing and humility and kindness and benevolence and friendship and empathy and generosity and truth and compassion and faith. And of course, one of his grandchildren said, "Which wolf will win?" And he said, "Whichever one I feed. Whichever one I feed." May God be with us today, that we may tiptoe toward a new story.